I would now like to call Reverend Chontell Washington to share some words with us. Reverend Washington is the director of the Rhode Island Council of Churches and part of the Interfaith Coalition Steering Committee. Chontell?
Good afternoon. I'd like to start out by reading you one verse out of the book of Hebrews, chapter 10, verse 24. And let us consider how to spur one another into love and good works. The Greek word behind spur is the word to provoke, to stir up. In a positive context, it means to entice or to motivate. And so this verse is saying that we are to entice one another towards love and good works. Poor people today have been joined by what I call the new poor. The poor are no longer solely the homeless and the hungry. The population of the poor has just multiplied exponentially. In 2019, there was a shift, and poor families who did not consider themselves as struggling are now the silent sufferers that you see on your Zoom screens every day of the week. They're keeping their heads up, they're showing up for virtual work, and they're not complaining about all that has crumbled in their lives. They're pushing into the category that they cannot even believe they've entered. Vice President Kamala Harris, in her book, that whenever there is a major push to present Congress into doing the right thing, activists and elected leaders implore the American people to call and write their representatives. She talks about citizens who are trapped in a cost of living crisis where everything from housing to healthcare to childcare and education is up and wages are not up. She refers to the hollowing out of the middle class. They are the new poor. Where young families and grandparents have childcare costs that surpass rents, mortgages, and sometimes college tuitions. And market rate rent is not balanced with the 40-hour work week of the state minimum wage. How are we selling this dream when we are not loving one another enough to do more than what we've already done? We can't afford to be too tired to do more. In 1968, Dr. King spoke about Black people being tired of children having to attend overcrowded inferior schools, having substandard housing and job hunting for jobs that didn't exist. Then in the same year, he was killed. And the vicious cycle of poverty still exists. What was considered to be one crisis away from poverty has become the new reality. And now we're no longer talking about the poor people that we don't know. We're talking about our own coworkers, our nice neighborhood neighbors, and the hardworking entrepreneurs that own homes right next to us. Access to safe and secure housing is not what it used to be. See, I believe that the shift in racial tension softened by many white people because they started having that one half Black person in their family. The brat doll looking first great grandchild who was now considered their normal person to love. Their hearts and their minds and their family dynamics changed the course of how they saw Black people. And the same phenomenon is now affecting the impoverished. Now, working people can relate to living paycheck to paycheck because their nest eggs diminished before their very eyes due to the COVID pandemic in 2020. They can unfortunately now relate to having to decide between a monthly medicine and another important cost. More people can now relate to what the noose feels like around their necks when they really don't have the funds to pay their existing bills. Now they get a feel for what the poor go through. How do we spur one another into love? We make the calls and write the letters to our representatives to make change, and how to get poor people activated into advocacy. But now more than ever, we can put a face on the struggling and the poor. Their voices are not loud enough to make changes by themselves. They need you. Their I can survive if I miss a paycheck voice to help make it known. Your allyship for the poor has to consist of legislation and advocacy, communicating more because all too often programs are developed and don't actually help people who are in need the way they need help. It has to consist of the voices of the poor. And we have to know that the new poor are going to continue to drown as well if we don't do something. And so while I have your attention, I want to tell you that money alone is not the answer. It certainly helps, but it is not the only answer. There needs to be a creation of more access and the destruction of barriers to access, information, and systemic changes. How do we help when the system is set up for poor people to make too much money so that they can't get food stamps, but they don't have enough money to buy food? We have to recognize that people are trying to now provide 3 meals a day for everyone that's home and snacks. But let me remind you who we're talking about. We're talking about the poor. Yes, the hungry. Yes, the homeless, but also the formerly incarcerated. We're talking about veterans and senior citizens, the newly unemployed, the on and off again unemployed, small business owners, and the already had been poor before COVID poor. The concept of poverty elevation exists, and we must be obligated, even if we have pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps. We cannot afford to expect that from people who have been forced to exist with no boots or just flip-flops. It is our duty to care deeper. We have to look more ways to love people enough to not only remove the barriers, but creatively change the course of keeping struggling families from falling. In the book of Deuteronomy, there's a reference to ensuring that the poor Israelites were given the opportunity for a new start, like a release from the trap of poverty. And I want you to know that you have opportunities by lifting your fingers and swiping and lifting your voices to encourage and instill policy and systemic changes to reduce and eradicate poverty. And it's not too late. And so if you have already, good for you. Do more. And if you haven't, get busy. Because there are people who you no longer bump into the Stop and Shop. And it's not because they're quarantined. It's because they're in the poverty lines for food, clothing, and other basic necessities. So what's love got to do with it? We have to love Rhode Islanders enough to be honest about race, economics, and education. We have to love Rhode Islanders enough to increase the minimum wage again and to ensure that veterans are receiving the appropriate benefits that they need. We have to love Rhode Islanders enough to avoid cutting fiscal line items that help the people who are poor. We have to love Rhode Islanders enough to create affordable housing and then allow people access to those opportunities, recognizing that they may have jobs and they may have records and they may have 2 parents in the household, and that these factors should not prevent them from accessing help to get out of poverty or to get back on their feet. We have to love Rhode Islanders enough to be uncomfortable every time we see a person economically encouraged to stand on the street corner holding a cup in order to survive just one more day. Each one of us has to be spurred into love and good works in order to be part of the changes needed in this new world of ours. Policies and budgets need to give attention to how they affect the marginalized. The way of the new world is new, but the problems are not. So leaders, do something better. Do something different. Not even the wealthiest can afford to be silent and stagnant about the existence and insurgence of poverty. Let us consider how to spur one another into love and good works, my friends. We cannot shrink behind yesterday's lawmaking traditions. We're looking for good works, friends, love, and good works. Amen.
Amen. That was really powerful and beautiful. Thank you so much, Reverend Washington, for your time and for being here today.